Hello and welcome. We'll just wait a few minutes while people join us. All right, if you're just joining us, we'll get started in just a minute while we wait for a few more people to join. Okay, let's get started. So good evening and welcome to the Hudson Library and Historical Society's live event with Abir Mukerjee, author of the Wyndham and Banerjee Mysteries. Before we get started, there are a few things I want to share with you. First, this program is a kickoff to our Explore India month. On Tuesday, April 12th at 10 a.m., the Cleveland Museum of Art will be giving a presentation entitled Gods and Heroes of India, which will feature works of art in their collection. Then on Monday, April 18th at 7 p.m., we will be talking with Priya Krishna, the author of the excellent cookbook Indianish. We also have another of other great programs this month, so be sure to visit our website at hudsonlibrary.org for more information. Following the presentation tonight, there will be time devoted to Q&A with the author. We encourage you to get involved by typing your questions into the Q&A section of Zoom at the bottom of the screen at any point during the program. Finally, The Learned Owl, our local independent bookstore, is selling copies of The Shadows of Men, and there's a link in the chat if you'd like to purchase one. And with that, let's get started. Tonight, I'm excited to welcome Abir Mukerjee. His 5-book Wyndham and Banerjee Mysteries series is set in Raj-era India. It has won multiple awards, including the Crime Writers Association Historical Dagger Award. His first book, A Rising Man, came out in 2017, and his latest book, the 5th in the series, The Shadows of Men, came out last November. Welcome, and please take it away.
Thank you, Nathan, and thank you for your kind invitation. It's wonderful to be here talking to the Hudson Library and Historical Society. Now, I've been speaking at events for quite a few years now, but I don't mind telling you that this session makes me quite nervous. It's partly because I think this is the first time I'm giving a talk to an American audience, but also because I'm sure you've had some great writers who I look up to in admiration, and you've had them on before. But also it's because this talk is a very personal affair for me. It's wrapped up with the factors that made me the person I am today, and how a certain place and time, India during the Raj period, shaped not just my life, but the lives of many of us, influencing the modern world in many, many ways, and how it was the catalyst for my writing. So my talk is entitled Place, Time, and Committing Murder to Scratch an Itch, researching and writing historical crime fiction, and how it helped me come to terms with my own identity. I suppose for this talk to be useful, I should tell you a wee bit about my background. Contrary to what you may think from my accent, I was actually born in London. But when I was 4 years old, my father seems to have asked himself this question: what's the coldest, wettest place I can raise a family? Well, the answer was obvious, and he moved to the west of Scotland in a little village called Bothwell outside of a town called Hamilton, which is in a county called Lanarkshire. Now, I don't expect any of you to know Hamilton. It's probably most famous for its football team, Hamilton Academicals, who've managed to go through several seasons without winning a game. But for those of us who grew up there, we will tell you that the town should be famous for something else. And that is its herd of Hamilton cattle, which are all white and they look something like this. Indeed, so proud are we of our Hamilton cattle that we had them stuffed, and for years they took pride of place in a display case on the top floor of the town hall. Yes, unfortunately, they all died and they were stuffed and sent to the town hall. I'm told they're not there anymore, but no one seems to be able to tell me what actually happened to them. So anyway, we as a family arrived in Hamilton in the late 70s. And at that time, the town, like its cattle, was pretty much all white. And in the village of Bothwell, we were the local colour. Now, you probably think you know where this is going. An Asian family suffering racist abuse from an unaccepting community. But while there was racism, no minority in Britain has ever escaped bigotry or abuse at some time in their lives. I have to be honest and say that the racism I suffered was comparatively mild. And I think that can be put down to two factors. Firstly, we were middle class, and in Britain, class counts for an awful lot. Middle class racism is far more genteel than the working class variety. And secondly, the west of Scotland was and is a very odd place. I don't know if many of you know the west of Scotland, but it's a place where the colour of your skin is less important than the sect of Christianity that your family nominally follows, where marrying a Hindu or a Muslim raises fewer eyebrows than marrying a Catholic or a Protestant from across the divide. Now, Glasgow and its environs, when I was growing up, was basically like Northern Ireland, but with bottles instead of Kalashnikovs, where your religious affiliation was all important. It might sound strange, but in the playground, I was asked this question: are you a Catholic or a Protestant? And for a 5-year-old Hindu boy, that was a very difficult question to answer. You know, I would react like this: I'm sorry, I'm a Hindu. And the question would be repeated: aye, but are you a Catholic Hindu or a Protestant Hindu? These were the philosophical issues upon which my childhood revolved. But there's a deeper point here, and it's one that centers on identity and difference and belonging. For me, the question wasn't whether I was Catholic or Protestant. It was more fundamental. Was I British, or was I Indian, or was I Scottish, or was I Bengali, Bengal being the part of India that my family came from, or was I somewhere in between? And that question of identity, of belonging and acceptance, it's something which I think all minorities, whether ethnic or LGBTQ, can identify with. The truth is, my childhood was rather wonderful, and a lot of that was down to the fact that the British, on the whole, are a remarkably tolerant, welcoming and inclusive people. If you disagree, I'd ask you to point to any other major country which gives its immigrants and their children more opportunities to become part of mainstream life than the UK, with the proviso that as long as you're middle class. But also, my childhood was idyllic because of my parents, who came from Bengal in India. My mother, as with most Indian mothers, still refuses to believe that her son can be a fully functioning adult without her constant and rigorous supervision. I should point out that I am now well into my 40s and married, but she does not seem to understand that I'm not her responsibility anymore. But it's my father, who passed away a few years ago, that I think is really important to this story. He wasn't a rich man. He came to the UK in 1964, as he would never tire of telling you, with £3 in my pocket. And that's him right there. As you can see, he was a great hit in the 1966 Accounts Department Christmas party. Just him and a whole load of women, which we quite liked. But he was intelligent and he educated himself, and he loved Britain. He would tell you how he had a low tolerance for hypocrisy. But the truth is, he was, to put it mildly, a professional contrarian, generally espousing the viewpoint most likely to irritate whoever it was he was talking to. But either way, it meant he didn't have many friends. In some ways, he reminded me of this character. So you might not know. Oh, wait, that's gone too far. Slide's gone missing. Anyway, he reminded me of a character that we used to have on British TV called Mr. Everything Comes from India. He was a character on a 1990s sketch show called Goodness Gracious Me. And if you asked him, he would tell you that pretty much everything and everyone of note came from India. For example, Shakespeare, Superman, Jesus, and Santa were all, according to this character, Indian. Now, my father probably wouldn't have gone as far as to claim that Superman or Santa was Indian, though, you know, in our family, the tooth fairy was definitely Indian. I'll never forget the conflicting emotions the morning after my first tooth fell out, looking under my pillow and discovering that the tooth fairy had left me one crisp 10 rupee note, which in Glasgow was about as much use as an inflatable dartboard. Excuse me, I'm just going to plug in my other computer. It's running out of juice. There we go. That's better. But my father was hell-bent on educating his children, and like many fathers, his idea of an educational day out would be to take me to the British Museum. I don't know if anybody else's parents took them to museums, but the British Museum is rather special because it tends to hold pretty much 50% of everything that we have looted from other parts of the world. And my father took great pleasure in describing to me in some detail the different parts of the world and the different cultures from which the British had stolen it all. Elgin marbles, stolen from Greece. Rosetta Stone, stolen from Egypt. And of course he had a special bile reserved for the misappropriation of items from India. Indeed, going to the British Museum with my dad was akin to taking a trip to the cave in which Ali Baba's 40 thieves stashed their loot. Now, some of you are probably wondering, what has any of this got to do with crime fiction? But I'll ask you to bear with me. The fact is, from an early age, my father taught me that there were two sides to every story. It sounds like a facile point, but for a 7-year-old, it's far from it. I would go to school and I would be taught something as fact. And then I would come home and my father would say to me, "It's good, but it's not true." And it turned out that half of the time he was wrong and half of the time the school was wrong. But the point is that from a very early age, I developed a healthy skepticism, a cynicism, if you will, a willingness to question whatever I was told. And it's not just me. I think all children who grow up as a minority in a culture that isn't of their parents, isn't that of their parents, I think they develop from an early age this natural cynicism, the realization that nothing is black and white, and that what we are taught at school as fact is often only one side of the story. So why do I need to write? You could say that my need to write stemmed from this wish to tell the other side of the story, to tell you about that road that is less trodden, to question the perceived wisdom. And maybe it's my version of my father's contrarianism. Now, I came to writing late. I started writing my first novel, A Rising Man, at the tender age of 39 3/4. But the seed of that novel was planted 24 years earlier. And it finds its origins in anger. Anger at my English teacher, who I have to say was a fantastic man. And it started off in my higher English class. Now, many of you may not be familiar with the Scottish education system. What I will tell you is it's far superior to the English one, or at least it was in my day. But I digress. So hires are like the final exams you do before you head off to college or university. And this story starts in my higher English class. See, one of the papers in the higher English exam in my day involved having to write an essay. It could be a descriptive essay, a work of fiction, or an argumentative essay, which would be in the form of a topic for discussion, such as, should euthanasia be legalized? Discuss. Now, wherever possible, I tended to go for these argumentative essays because there was a set formula to answering it.
You would set out 3 arguments for the side you agreed with, 2 or 3 arguments against, making sure that you undermined them as professionally and as politely as you could, and then have a conclusion which summed up your argument, that your first argument was the right one. I always chose the argumentative essay wherever I could. It was easy marks, a straight A, and I'm ashamed to say it didn't involve too much imagination on my part. Now, in the month before the final exams, we spent a lot of time doing practice essays. And on one particular day, the topic for discussion was, well, the truth is, I can't remember the question specifically. It had something to do with whether we can learn from history. And I jumped at the chance to answer it. It appealed to the contrarian in me. For the first time, here was a question that really appealed to me. I would point out that history is written by the winners and that you couldn't learn from history if you whitewashed it. And to do that, I would point to the Bengal famine of 1943. Now, many of you may not have heard, I would imagine most of you have not heard of the Bengal famine. So let me tell you a wee bit about it. In the middle of World War II, when a similar number of Jews were being wiped out in Europe, 3 to 4 million subjects of the British Empire were allowed to starve to death, if not directly on Churchill's orders, certainly because of his negligence. Now, the whole world is aware of the Holocaust. Indeed, there are many laws in countries making it illegal to deny that the Holocaust took place. And yet, what of the 3 million Indians who were effectively sentenced to death at the same time? There is a resounding silence. Now, you're asking, how do I know about this? The truth is, my father lived through it. My father was a teenager at the time in Calcutta during the famine. And this was a man-made famine. This was a famine that was brought about by taking away the transportation from Bengal. The Japanese were on the doorsteps of India, and it was decided by Churchill and others to remove all riverine transport. What that meant is that rice prices skyrocketed, and despite there being enough food, the peasants, the poor of Bengal, couldn't get to it. And so millions starved, and my father remembers skeletons walking into the streets of Calcutta and dying on the streets. And he would tell me about that. It affected him immensely. I don't think you can live through that without being affected by it. And I would pour the years of angst about the constant contradictions of growing up as the child of immigrants in a society that was taught it was always on the right side of everything. I would go to school and I grew up in Britain where we are taught to lionize Winston Churchill. And at the same time, I knew from my parents that Winston Churchill was at least partly responsible for the deaths of 3 million Indians, people who looked like me, people who were my father and mother's people. Now, how do you reconcile that as a kid? This was my chance. This essay would be my chance to pour out this angst. In short, I was going to be clever. Of course, I should have known that it doesn't pay to be too clever at school. I was expecting an A for this, an A plus, and I didn't get it. In fact, I got a C minus, which for an Indian kid was a bit like being mugged. To my teacher's credit, he decided he'd discuss it with another of the English teachers in the department, but at the end of the day, they gave me this C minus. He gave me an explanation as to why they decided to give me that C minus, which centered around the point that I couldn't say that dropping an atom bomb on defenseless Japanese civilians or causing millions of Indians to starve to death was as big a sin as gassing people in a concentration camp. I made that mistake of moral equivalence. Now, maybe you can't compare them. Maybe one sin is greater than the other. But to me, they were and are stops along the same road heading for the same destination. They stem from the idea that certain people are more human than others. Certain people have more right to be saved than others. I learnt some important lessons that day. The first, as I've said, is that it doesn't pay to be too clever, especially at school. But more importantly, it taught me that challenging people's accepted beliefs, telling people something they don't want to hear, especially when it involves self-reflection, is extremely difficult. Still, that seed, that need to talk about the Bengal famine, planted in anger in my English class, never left me, not even after a quarter of a century. At the same time, as I grew older and I visited India regularly, I became aware that Indians too tend to whitewash this period in our shared history. Just as the British, when they think of the Raj, often romanticize it with gin and tonics on the veranda or summers in the hill stations of Simla where the climate is like Surrey, Indians tend to romanticize the freedom struggle, preferring not to focus on the fact that the British rule in India could not have functioned without the active participation of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Indians. Let's not forget that even Gandhi advocated Indian involvement in the Great War on the side of the British as part of its obligations as a member of the empire. The accepted history of the Raj is very different in Britain to that in India, and I became fascinated with the subject of British India because neither the British version of history nor the Indian version chimed with what I knew, what I felt in my bones sitting between these two cultures. I didn't believe the Indian version because a lot of it boils down to the premise that the British in India were some sort of amoral devils without conscience, perfidious Albion, in much the same way that Europeans view the Mongols, heartless, cruel oppressors. And that didn't chime what I know of the British people. At the same time, the view in Britain is still prevalent that the empire was, on balance, a force for good. And to me, that is ridiculous. And it's a stance that needs to be challenged and challenged at every turn. I think we have, in our desire to airbrush, forgotten the true legacies of that period. We've thrown the baby out with the bathwater, if you will. And while there may be a veritable ocean of bathwater, we should still remember the baby. And I came to be fascinated by several questions. The first was, what was the relationship between the British and the Indians really like? Now, it evolved over time, especially after 1857, which the British call the Indian Mutiny, but which the Indians refer to as the First War of Independence. So you see, immediately we have two different views of history, one calling it a mutiny, one calling it a war of independence. The second question I wanted to ask myself was, well, I went to a Christian school. I learned the values of love and compassion laid out in the Gospels, and I wanted to know, how does a moral Christian people justify to itself the oppression of another race? And third, and for me one of the most fascinating questions, was that of identity. Not just my identity, but yours too, if you're British or Indian or Anglo-Saxon. What was it about these two peoples, the British and the Indians, that in the 1920s and 30s, when the world was gripped by the evils of fascism and Stalinism, where any dissent was met by a bullet or a gulag or a gas chamber, that these two peoples, the British and the Indians, played out this non-violent freedom struggle? It was the world's first one, and it led directly, in terms of ideas, to the civil rights movement in America of Martin Luther King, and it led to Nelson Mandela's freedom struggle in apartheid. But it started with the British and the Indians, and it happened when a time when the world was going mad. And I stress, it takes two sides to play this game. I can't imagine a non-violent struggle succeeding against the Nazis or the Soviet communists of the period. What was it about these two peoples, the British and the Indians, that allowed them to play out this theatre, this non-violent struggle that had never occurred anywhere in the world previously, at this time when the world was going mad? And let's be clear, that was unique. And I'll prove to you it was unique. In the middle of London, in the middle of Parliament Square, there is a statue, not to Churchill, but to Mahatma Gandhi. The man who kicked the British out of India has his statue in the heart of our democracy. Now that says something special about the British people as well as the Indian people. And if you doubt it's special, then go to Paris and show me the statue of Ho Chi Minh or Ben Bella. They're not there. Now, these are the questions that fascinated me, and these are the questions that burned within me and which I wanted to bring to the attention of more people. The question was, how? And the answer, of course, was crime fiction. Um, as I've said, the question of making sense of one's identity isn't a new thing. I'm guessing many people have gone on a similar journey before. For me, there was only one answer, and that was writing a crime novel. Why a crime novel and not factual history of these topics? Several reasons. Firstly, crime fiction is what I love. I've read all types of literature, literary fiction, science fiction. I've even read some romantic fiction, though I'm not particularly proud about that. But my home is the crime novel in all its wonderful subgenres, from American hardboiled crime through the Golden Age English country house murders, through Scandinavian noir. The historical crime fiction novel, the idea of a good man upholding a corrupt system, such as Martin Cruz-Smith's Arkady novels, Robert Harris's Xavier Marsh, or the one and only Philip Kerr's Bernie Gunther novels. And of course, then there's the crime novel as social commentary, which in my head at least I associate with the great Scottish crime writers, starting with William McIlvanney and encompassing Val McDermid, Ian Rankin, and Denise Mina, to name but a few. Authors who know how to teach us something, to make a moral point at the same time as telling a cracking story. And I grew up in those traditions, so it felt natural for me to use the crime novel as part of my own journey, and my wish to explore this history, which, like so much of my life, I didn't feel comfortable with. But there were other reasons for crime and mystery novels rather than factual history. One of those was reach. The fact is, far more people are likely to read a crime novel set during the Raj than will read a history book about it. And as I learned at school, telling people what they don't want to hear is difficult. I can vouch for that for myself. During the period when after Brexit, I couldn't turn on the TV and watch the news because it was too painful. People find it very difficult to listen to or read a message that they don't agree with or something that challenges their accepted beliefs. They're much more likely to listen to your message if it's wrapped up in a cracking story. And if I may use two terribly mixed and cliched metaphors, to get to someone to swallow their medicine, it's often best to sugar the pill. So, the writing of the novel, the importance of place. So when I set out to write my novel, to make sense of the period of empire in a way that I could accept, to examine its effects on the governing, the British, as well as the governed, the Indians, and do that, I wanted to do all of that while wrapping it up in a crime novel with a healthy body count. To do justice to my subject, though, I realised I needed several viewpoints. I needed that of the Englishman, that of the Indian, and that of the Anglo-Indian, that ethnic group in limbo that was ostracized by both Indian and English. They were the product of generations when white people would intermarry with Indians. It was only later on, especially after 1857, as British power grew in India, that they saw themselves as superior to the natives. And so my novel, while it is my first novel is narrated solely by the Englishman, Sam Wyndham. There are other characters who are fundamental to the novel. Sergeant Surendranath Banerjee, rechristened Surrendernaut by his British superiors, because as you probably know, British people can't pronounce foreign names longer than one syllable. And also Annie Grant, an Anglo-Indian woman. But just as important as character was place. Where in India to set the book? And to me, setting is so much more than just a place on a map. It's a living, breathing amalgam of its geography, its climate, its atmosphere, its smells, its people, its politics, its history. A place shapes culture, and culture shapes characters. A Londoner differs from a Glaswegian, who differs from a New Yorker just as dramatically as he does from somebody from the Outer Hebrides. Those differences are in part shaped by the place, the weather, the politics, the day-to-day challenges of existence, even the cuisine. All of these shape the people and their stories. And in the best novels, place can become a character in itself. For me, as I say, one of my favourite crime novels is Laidlaw by the Scottish author William McIlvanney, probably the father of what we call tartan noir. Mark McIlvanney's characterisation of the city of Glasgow is amazing. It's a very strange mystery novel. Indeed, we know very early on, probably in the first chapter, who committed the crime. And in many ways, the rest of the novel is a love story to the city of Glasgow, a city that both he and I adore. So back to my question, where to set my novel? Should it be Delhi, the seat of political power from 1911, or Bombay, probably India's most high-profile city these days, and one which was most recognisable to my target audience of British and American readers? Or should it be somewhere else? There was, fortunately for me, an obvious answer, and that was a city founded by empire, an Indian city which in many ways was the physical embodiment of British India, and that city was Calcutta. It was the capital of British India for about 150 years, and while Delhi had been the Mughal capital of India and Bombay a mere trading post, it was Calcutta that was the living, breathing heart of the Raj. Calcutta, a city which was founded in true British fashion in the middle of a malarial-infested Bengal swamp. It was where the British and the Indians took those tentative first steps, at first as relative equals, keen to learn from each other, but then as time went on and British power grew, they became involved in a more unequal relationship. The Enlightenment came to India through Calcutta, in large part brought by Scots, sparking what is now known as the Bengal Renaissance of the 18th and 19th century. There was an outpouring of art and literature and culture, all in this one city. And it is in Calcutta that serious organised resistance to British rule began, and where it continued right up to 1947. There was no doubt for me that Calcutta had to be the place for my novel. Of course, it helped that both of my parents also came from there and that I understood the language and had an insight into that peculiar culture of the place, including its British influence. And it helped that Calcutta is one of the most interesting and odd places, I think, on the planet. I don't know how much you know about Calcutta, or Kolkata as it's known these days. It doesn't have the best of reputations. Most people have heard of the black hole of Calcutta, they've heard of the poverty, they've heard of Mother Teresa and her orphanage. But as always, there's another side. Remember that other side to us, every story. The fact is that the city has a love affair with art, with the arts and literature. It has more theatres than London and New York put together. Bengali, the language of most of the city's inhabitants, was the first Asian language into which the Shakespeare's works were translated. What's more, the works of the French writer Molière were translated into Bengali before they were ever translated into English. And of course, the first non-white winner of the Nobel Prize from Literature, Rabindranath Tagore, the Bard of Bengal, was a son of Calcutta. If you go to Calcutta Airport and you look up at the ceiling, you'll see that it's covered in handwriting. And these are the words from Tagore's work, Gitanjali, for which he won the Nobel Prize, and they're written in his own handwriting. Calcutta is the sort of place where a rickshawwala is likely to hum a 100-year-old tune by a Nobel laureate, as he is the latest Bollywood hit. It's where a taxi driver will quote you Shakespeare before gouging you 400 rupees for a 100-rupee journey. And it's the only city I know where there was a riot because the book fair finished a day early. Calcutta is the home of invention too. The fact that malaria was transmitted by mosquitoes was discovered in Calcutta. It was home to physicist Satyendranath Bose, the man who gave his name to the boson. And also in the field of crime detection, Calcutta has played its part, because it was here that the science of fingerprinting was first codified. Calcutta Police Department had a fingerprint bureau 5 years before Scotland Yard. The work was done by two Indians, one Hindu and one Muslim, Hemchandra Bose and Aziz ul Haq. But of course, it's their boss, Sir Edward Henry, who took the credit, and it's still called the Henry system to this day. That's the British way, taking credit, you see. Not so. Not only does place add authenticity to one's writing, the language, the culture, but in my case, it also helped to provide the answers I was seeking to my own questions around identity and this curious relationship between the British and the Indians. Calcutta provided me with the human perspective on empire, the relationships between individual Indians and Brits. For example, there was a close friendship and exchange of ideas between individual Scots, such as Patrick Geddes, who was a Scottish polymath, and Indian Nobel laureate Rabindranath Tagore. They met in India while the First World War was raging, and they found common ground and shared ideas of education in harmony with one's surroundings, a sustainable environment, rural reconstruction, and peace. Tagore invited Geddes to provide the plans for his university, while Geddes invited Tagore to become president of the Indian College in Montpellier. They stayed friends until Geddes' death in 1932. So if you look at it from a distance, it looks like the relationship between the British and the Indians was one of a chasm. But when you look at the individual relationships, you'll see that there were many, many friendships. The fact is that the Indian National Congress, the party of Gandhi, was founded by a Scot. It wasn't founded by an Indian. And Calcutta also showed me that my own cultural schizophrenia was something that was shared by institutions. What do I mean by that? Well, I was lucky enough to visit the Calcutta Police Museum as part of my research. And the museum has all these different rooms designating different periods from the police force, Calcutta Police Force's history. And for some reason, I entered the museum, or the rooms I entered tended to start with the modern day and work their way backwards. So the first room I entered was the war on terrorism. And you see all of these fine officers standing over terrorists and getting bombed and, and foiling plots and things like this. And then you step back a room and you go into the war on drugs. And similarly, you have these these heroic policemen, defeating terrible drug runners. But you keep going back, and then something weird happens. You go back to 1947 and the period before it, before independence, and suddenly the whole emphasis of the museum changes. The police are no longer the heroes. The police are suddenly the organs of a repressive regime, and it's the freedom fighters, those fighting for independence, that the museum concentrates on. So something happens to that organization between one day in 1947 and the other, when they go from being the upholders of a terrible, terrible oppressive system to suddenly becoming the defenders of a democracy. That cultural schizophrenia is a conflict and a contradiction. So place helped me make sense of some of these attitudes. It helped me make sense of the need for the British to set themselves apart from the natives, the need to be different. The fact is that the British told themselves, we are going out there to civilize. And when so many got there, they realized that nothing could be further from the truth. What they were actually there to do was to exploit. And it was only by proving to the Indians and to themselves that they were somehow morally superior that they felt they had the mandate to govern. If they were to mix with the natives very quickly would see through this pretend moral superiority. But also history and place showed me that by no means all British were as high-handed and as haughty as I expected, and how most Indians still believe they were. So what have I learned? Well, writing novels has been cathartic. It's helped me come to terms with who I am. And it's helped me to shout what I knew in my bones, that the perceived wisdom and the history that's handed down to us about that time and that place is flawed. My research into that time and place revealed so much that we've forgotten, such as the codification of fingerprints by a Hindu and a Muslim. place helps one make sense of the differences between us. They say that to understand someone, you should walk a mile in their shoes. I say go see where they live, spend time in their place, and you'll understand so much more about them. And if that's not good enough, writing novels has been a very good way of getting revenge on my English teacher who gave me that C minus. Thank you very much. I'll take questions now.
Yeah, thank you. That was awesome. I can't really think of a better way to kick off our Explore India month because you just go into such great detail. We will be taking questions, so feel free to post them in the Q&A session. And while we're waiting, I have a few for you. First, I was wondering, so that was great how you're talking about the relationships between the British and the Indians, and you really show that with your characters, Sam Wyndham and Sergeant Surin Banerjee. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about them, a little biographical sketches.
Absolutely, absolutely. So Sam Wyndham is a British detective. He's ex-Scotland Yard, and he is a survivor of the First World War. And the war changes him. He suffers what we would term PTSD. He's lost all of his friends during that war. He's lost his wife in the influenza epidemic at the end of it. And he ends up in Calcutta mainly because it's slightly preferable to suicide. He has nothing else to live for. And he's offered this job in Calcutta and he goes there. There he meets a wide-eyed sergeant, part of the Indianification of the police force that the British were introducing at the time. A sergeant called Surendranath Banerjee, who the British call Surrender Not because they can't pronounce his name. And I wish I had made that up, but that is an actual fact. There was a man called Surendranath Banerjee, and he was known as Surrender Not. And he was actually given a knighthood at one point, so he became Sir Surrender Not Banerjee. So I stole the name from history. But Surin is much younger. He's in his early 20s, and he looks up to Sam as this sort of godlike figure who's come across from Scotland Yard. But he's quickly disabused of that. I should point out that Surin he's better educated than Sam. He comes from a richer family. He was educated at Cambridge. And he's probably more intelligent than Sam, but because of the colour of his skin, he's destined to always be the subaltern in the system of government of his own country. But he is both of them are outcasts. So Sam has nothing to live for. At the same time, the war has taught him not to believe what his superiors tell him. So he's a cynic. He's a man who's, seen that his superiors, his class superiors, know very little, and he doesn't trust them anymore. He's one of the first generation of modern British men. As I've said, we live in a very class-bound society in Britain, far more so then than we do now. And he would have been brought up to respect his elders and his betters. But he sees through that in the First World War. And so when he gets to India, he is less likely to believe everything he's told. He wants to see things through his own eyes. And so he's less racist than, say, many of his colleagues. So Sam and Surin really are the double act at the heart of my novels. And they came to me pretty much at the same time, I think within minutes of each other. And they represent the two sides of me. Sam is my sort of jaded, cynical, but also my British half. And Surin is my more optimistic, but he's also my Indian half. And this constant, I talked about cultural schizophrenia, this constant dialogue goes on in my head between my British half, my Western half, and my Indian half, always questioning the other. The thing about when you sit outside of the mainstream is you can point to idiosyncrasies, you can point to hypocrisies. So, the Western rational half of myself will point out the hypocrisies and the idiosyncrasies of my Indian side. So, when my mother at the age of 3 took me to the doctors because she was convinced, because I was left-handed and she was convinced it was the devil's work, that sort of thing grates to my British half. At the same time, my Indian half points out all of the hypocrisies of growing up in the west of Scotland in this society that's taught to hate people who look exactly the same but worship Christianity slightly differently. So when you sit between cultures, you have that dialogue, and sometimes they're at loggerheads, but other times they work in harmony. What they do is they give you, how should I put it? It's like thinking in stereo. You get a wider view of the world, and sometimes that conflicts, and sometimes it comes together. Now, Sam and Surin can question the society of British India because they are both outsiders, and they can point out the flaws in both. Sorry, that was a very long answer, wasn't it? I do apologize.
Yeah, that was great though. We have a question from the audience. How and where did you research 1920s Calcutta? And I wanted to add a follow-up question. If we wanted to read more about this time period, if you have any like book recommendations or resources you could recommend.
Sure. Well, let's start with how and why. Now, how and where. Um, I'm very, very lucky in that I've been going to Calcutta since I was a kid. So I have family there. Um, and I've spent a lot of time there. I'll be honest with you, I hated it until I was about 15, 16. It was, the poverty, the problems, the heat. It all was just too much. But then I think when you reach a certain age, you grow up a bit and you look beyond the you look beneath the surface of things, and you realize the depth to a place. I found, and I'm pretty sure this is the same in America, you'll find that hard places that have had things hard, have a certain joy to the people. I mean, there's a humor that comes with living in a hard place. And I think Calcutta has that. Calcutta is one of these weird places where nobody actually wants to work for a living. A British man once said back in the days of the Raj that Bengalis, so Bengal is the part of India that Calcutta is placed. He said that Bengalis believe that they were put on earth to write poetry and paint pictures when the dirty work should be done by someone else. And that's very true. Even today, people pretend to work until like 4 or 5 in the day, and then they'll rush off to their poetry society or their amateur dramatics en masse as a city. There's so many people producing really bad poetry in Calcutta. It's quite concerning, but it's that sort of place. In terms of researching it, being there really helped. And Calcutta is one of these places that wears its history on its sleeves. It's all around you. The city is crumbling, but you still have these magnificent old ruins of Raj era buildings. At the same time, I went to the British Museum and I did a lot of research there. So really, it depends. I've done a lot of research on historical facts, either online or in the British Museum, British Library, or on the ground, say at the Police Museum in Calcutta. But as I said, if you want to get the sense of a place, it's much more than just book learning. You have to actually be there, I think, to a degree. For me, understanding a place is getting into the humor of a place. If you can crack the code of the people, that's to me what makes a place, and humor is a big part of that, but also the sights and the smells. It's not to say I always get everything right. I made the mistake. I made several mistakes in the first drafts of the first book. I assumed, having watched too many Bollywood movies, that the police uniforms in Calcutta would be khaki because they're khaki in the rest of India. But in Calcutta, they're white, and they've always been white since the time of the British. Now, if I hadn't gone to Calcutta, between draft 1 and 2, I wouldn't have noticed that, and people would have thought, he knows nothing of our city. He got the uniform. So, it's these sorts of things, and I assumed that it's the I think as Donald Rumsfeld once said, it's the unknown unknowns that trip you up. It's what you don't know you don't know. So I assumed again that the earth, the color of the earth in Calcutta would be red, as it is in most of North India. But Calcutta sits in the Ganges Delta, and you have all of this silt coming from the Himalayas and everywhere else, and the earth in the city is black. And again, it's these things that you don't find in textbooks. that you really only get when you're on the ground. And so for me, the research was a mix of things. But really, the third part to that is really the culture. And I grew up to a degree steeped in the culture of the city because that's where my parents were from. And so I understood to a degree what makes the place tick. It's one of these places where parts of me only really make sense when I'm in Calcutta, and I never understood why. So my natural laziness, what I see, what other people see as lazy, isn't laziness at all. It's my natural artistic bent that I get from coming from that place. It's in my genes. So, so it's a combination of all of these things, shall we say?
Right.
Oh, and your question as to what else to read on Calcutta. There's quite a lot in terms of historical crime fiction. Um, I'll tell you a couple of favorites. So Bengal has a detective called Byomkesh Bakshi, who is a contemporary of Sherlock Holmes. He's the Indian Sherlock Holmes. And he it was written by a guy called, and you're never going to pronounce this, you're going to have to look it up. It's a guy called Shorodindo Bandopodhai, right? That's his name, Shorodindo Bandopodhai, and he wrote the Byomkesh Bakshi novels. And they are set in the 1920s and 30s, and they go on to about the 50s. But what's really odd about them, what I found odd about them, is whilst many of them take place during the Raj, it's almost as if they exist in a parallel universe. So you don't really see the British, you see the Bengali or the Indian side of Calcutta. You're aware that the British are there, but they're there as a sort of amorphous background. The stories are purely Bengali or Indian stories. They're contained in that sort of world. And that was curious to me because when I was researching, I was reading these novels and I wanted to know more about the relationship between the British and the Indians. And here in these novels, the British presence is always hovering, but it's almost ignored. So that was quite surprising. Another great Bengali detective is a guy called Feluda. And that was written by Satyajit Ray, who you may remember. He's a great film director. He won an Oscar for his life's work. And he wrote a number of detective novels as well, in the way that Bengalis do. You know, they're Renaissance men and women. So he wrote these, and these are a big favorite. But these are more for kids. But Byomkesh Bakshi, I think, was the first true. Well, no, there were others before, but he's the one that is most remembered from that period as a detective.
Yeah, I just want to comment that you really make the cities come alive. So they're mostly set in Calcutta, but the characters travel all over, and they're just such vibrant recreations. And yeah, you need to read the books.
Yes, you need to read the books. Quite right. You tell him, Nathan.
Our next question is, someone was wondering if the books have been made into a television series or if there are any plans.
Well, we have optioned the rights to an American company called Cavalry Media, who I think have certain of the people who were responsible for House of Cards, etc. And we do have a pilot script. We were about to go to market just as COVID hit. I think the issue that we have is that it's historical, so it's period drama, and it's set in India, and it involves British people, and so it's very difficult. It doesn't fall into one particular bucket. So the Indians think it's British or it's period, and it's expensive to make because of these things. I'm sure it will get made, but I can't tell you when. Hopefully sooner rather than later, but. There's a lot of interest. It's just a question of finding the right home for it at the right time. Now, I would love the BBC to make this. I think the BBC would do it real justice. But I'd just as happily see Netflix make it, or Apple. But let's see. See, you Americans, you've got deep pockets. You should be telling me when this is going to be made. But we'll wait and see.
All right, that's exciting though.
Yeah.
Yeah. We have someone who states Chris says, I'm a fan of Denise Mina, Ian Rankin, and Glasgow. From your descriptions of Calcutta, it sounds as if it shares some attitude in common with Glasgow, and I suppose you'd be the person to know. if that's
Well, let me answer that. Firstly, let me just say I completely agree. Who asked the question? What was it?
Chris.
Chris. Chris, I completely agree with both. Denise Miner to me is one of the greatest British authors, regardless of genre. I think the way she captures character, the way she gets into the heads of people. I think very few authors have that ability, at least in Britain. She's one of the greatest authors, and if you haven't read her work, please do. I would recommend a book called The Long Drop, which is about a fictional account of 24 hours in the life of a real character who was a Glasgow serial killer. And in true Glasgow fashion, it's about 24 hours when he goes on a drinking spree with the father of one of his victims. That could only happen in Glasgow, where the two of them get drunk for 24 hours. And this is a guy who's suspected of killing this other guy's, daughter and wife. But it's a fascinating book, and so I would read that if you haven't. But Denise Miner's works is brilliant. To answer your question about Glasgow and Calcutta, I've often felt that. And they are similar in certain regards. They're both known or were known as the second city of the empire. Lots of cities claim to be the second city of the empire, but Glasgow and Calcutta, I think, have a special claim. They were both cities that had their heyday during the empire. Glasgow was built on trade with the empire, as was Calcutta. So much of Scotland's wealth has come from India and from Bengal in particular. So we have a town called Paisley, just outside of Glasgow. Now, you may have heard of the Paisley pattern, which Prince was quite fond of, but that Paisley pattern comes from India. It comes from Bengal, and the links between Glasgow and Calcutta run very, very deep, and they are similar cities in terms of the fact that they've had their best days. They're both cities in decline. They're both hard cities. They're both cities with humour. But there are deep, deep cultural connections between the two. And I've often felt like my whole life has been shaped by these two cities that have had their heyday long before I was ever dreamt of. So, and it's curious. It really is curious that these two cities, in many ways, are the mirror image of each other. And their peoples are certainly mirror images. I think a wise man once said that Bengalis are like Scots, but with less access to alcohol. I think there's quite a bit of truth to that.
All right, someone is very interested in reading your books, but they're wondering,
Ah.
do you have to read them in order? What would you recommend?
Well, I would say, Pamela, that you can read them in order. You don't have to. I would say you should because they follow on chronologically. So the first book is set in 1919, the second in 1920, the third in 21, and so on. When I started this series, I thought I was going to write a book a year between 1919 and Indian independence in 1947. What I forgot is that that's almost 30 years. And I should point out that I'm from Glasgow, as you know, and Glasgow has the lowest life expectancy in Europe. So I'm not sure I'm going to get to the end of it. But yes, to answer your question, you might as well read them in order, in chronological order, because there's the strand that runs through them of these two men aging in real time, and the events that form the backdrop to the books happen in real time. There's no need to. I mean, the books are self-contained, but yeah, go on. If you're going to read them, go on, read them in order. I will say they get better. So you'll forgive me if you don't like the first one. They do get. I hadn't written anything before this first book, so the first novel I wrote was A Rising Man, and so I've been learning. I'm still learning, but hopefully I'm getting a wee bit better each time. So please do try them, Pamela.
Yeah, I would concur. You can read them in any order, but I love how the characters grow and there's real stakes, and so like they change from book to book.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I should point out that the first four books are all narrated solely by Sam, but Surin, during the books he's growing as a character, and when we get to book five, he narrates half of the book, and that wasn't some conscious plan. that I had. It was something that Surin decided on by himself. He basically said, "No, I'm going to take more of a role." I always knew he would, but I expected it to be 10 books down the road. But it's happened by by book 4, he's taking a stand, and he's realizing that Sam isn't all he's. I should point out that Sam has in the first couple of books he has an opium addiction, which he kicks. But part of that is it helps the scales to fall from Surin's eyes in terms of Sam isn't this wondrous super detective, but that doesn't diminish his love for Sam. It doesn't diminish their friendship.
Yeah. So we're about out of time, but can you tell us about anything you have coming up?
I can. So right now the 5th book, as you know, is out. There will be a 6th book in the series. I haven't started that yet, and that's because I've been writing a standalone, which is set in America in 2024, in the run-up to the presidential elections, and that's a thriller. But as usual, anything I write tends to deal with issues that are upsetting me or things that are bothering me. And this book really explores issues of radicalization and the state of the American dream or the Western dream. The the contract that a country, say, let's say America in this case, the contract that America had with its people, that you work hard, you obey the rules, you pay your taxes, and your lives will get better. That contract that's lasted between the Second World War until the 90s or even the early 2000s, that doesn't hold anymore, for a large number of people. And I wanted to explore that. I wanted to explore the impacts of that and what that meant for American society, because it's the same issues that affect Europe, that affect Britain, they affect India. This growth of populism that we're seeing in many, many parts of the world, I think, stems from the collapse of the contract that the state had with its people. And for me, the greatest case in point is America. So what we have is two parents, a white American woman and a Bangladeshi British Muslim man, trying to find their kids before their kids can commit some terrorist atrocity. So it's really a story of parents trying to save their kids before something terrible happens. And that should be out next year.
If people want to keep up with what you're working on, how can they do that?
You can follow me on Twitter. I tweet an awful lot. I do apologize. That's at Radio Mookers. You can get me on Instagram on the same thing, or my Facebook author page, Abir Author, or the website, abirmukerjee.com. I'm sure you'll find it. But I will hopefully be in the States next year to publicize this new book, which fingers crossed, assuming I get it right. I've just handed in the second draft, and hopefully both my US and my UK editors will like it. If they don't, I could be a bit depressed next week. We'll see. We'll see what they say.
All right. Well, thank you so much. There was a question. The first book is A Rising Man. All 5 books are available in our catalog. They're also on Hoopla. This is the newest book, Shadows of Men. And thank you so much.
Thank you all for tuning in. It's wonderful to be able to speak to you, and I hope that at some stage we get to meet in person. I'd really like that.
That'd be great. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Good night, everyone.